On this week's Faith versus Culture, anti-Semitism is on the rise on the left and on the right. What should we do about it? That's coming up.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News channel. I'm Tré Goins-Phillips. I'm joined by Raj Nair. Raj, we just want to dive right in here. So anti-Semitism in the United States is continuing to balloon. The Wall Street Journal this week even said that far-right anti-Semitism is spiking. Where does the issue of anti-Semitism stand across the country right now?
Oh, that's a heartbreaking question, because I always thought, as a student of the Holocaust, I've been to Israel 30 times. I naively thought, oh, well, it'll never come here. And if it comes here, it's those crazy people at Columbia and Harvard that have lost their minds that, are chanting ridiculous things. But it'll never come to like the mainstream, I even hate to use this word, but conservative Christian spheres. But it has. And I think what's studying this at length, what I realize is it's not racism. It's not just, oh, the Jewish people, I'm not a fan. I mean, some people would say that, or it's, they do this, they do that. In my opinion, as someone who's basically dedicated their life to this for the past, decade or so, it's a spiritual thing. There's a demonic force in this world that hates the Jewish people. And I think it's because of scripture. I first got into the Israel space because of, Israel is the one place in the Middle East that, women have equal rights and Christians are protected and blah, blah, blah. But then as I fell in love with the Old Testament, I'm like, wow, I've totally misunderstood the greater plan that God has for the people of Israel. And so to see it exploding on the right with, I don't want to name names, but it's important. Well, I guess I'm going to, but it's important to talk about it. I mean, Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan, these people that have a lot of other great things to say, have platformed and or said some just abhorrent, obvious lies. I mean, literally, Joseph Goebbels, if you know who that is, he was kind of the propaganda minister of the Nazis of the Third Reich. I mean, verbatim saying some of these things, and I'm just like, I have a hard time believing that we're here again. And I know we're going to get into this, but I have a Holocaust survivor friend who recently passed away who said, look, guys, the Holocaust didn't start with gas chambers. It didn't start with Zyklon B and Majdanek and Treblinka and Auschwitz. It started with words. It started with the othering of the Jewish people. Then it moved to boycotts. And surprise, surprise, we're there. And so to see it on the left and the right, I guess it shouldn't be shocking because this has been happening for 4,000 years, but it is sad.
How much of this can we chalk up to just the social media sphere that exists now, right? One popular host has this person, so then not even thinking about it, somebody else as well, because they had them. I'm also a huge influencer, so I need to talk to this person about this thing. How much of it is just mindlessly spiraling into bringing these kinds of people and terrible thought leaders into the conversation? And how much of it is that spiritual blindness that you're talking about?
I think everybody wants a scapegoat, right? I think everyone wants to blame someone for the world's problems. And if 9/11 and JFK and, the German collapse in World War I, and if the river turning red, and I mean, the Roman Empire, there's mice, and I mean, it's all, the Jewish people, it's their fault. So I think sometimes it scratches a natural itch to want to have a scapegoat, which ironically, scapegoat is a Jewish practice from the temple days. And so I think you combine that with, and if you don't know the news industry well, you are doing your job, the more people you can get to watch your content and stay on your content. It's kind of sick and twisted. And so the more outlandish, the more ridiculous, the more that you get riled up, you're doing a good job if you get people to watch your stuff. And that's honestly one of the main reasons I love working at CBN is that's not our motto. That's not our goal. We just tell the news and we bring a Christian perspective to it, and the rest happens. But a lot of these faces, they see, oh, this person had this crazy person on. I'm going to platform that person because it'll get me clicks. And the thing is if you don't know the back end of a lot of these things like YouTube, clicks equal money. The more people that watch your content, you get more money. So if you're a YouTuber that has a platform, it's incentivized to be outlandish. And so I think it's the demonic force of anti-Semitism mixed with a whole bunch of crazy social media things at the same time.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree with that more. And look, there is this burgeoning anti-Semitism on the right for all of the reasons that you just outlined, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the flourishing anti-Semitism that we also see on the political left. So talk about some of these perspectives, the two ends of those poles, and how that's impacting U.S. policy and U.S. perspective on the nation of Israel.
Yeah, so I want to make sure that I say everything very carefully because anything can be taken out of context. When it comes to the large portion of progressive left-wing hatred of Israel, which is bled into the Jewish people, it's based on this weird faux colonial idea of what the state of Israel is, which is just void of all historic background. I mean, people say I'm not anti-Israel, or sorry, I'm not anti-Jewish, I'm just anti-Zionist, which to me is like saying I'm not anti-Dutch, I just don't like people from Holland living in the Netherlands. It's like, what? Like the Zionism is the longing of the Jewish people to be in their homeland that they've been for 4,000 years. I mean, I don't know if you can make an argument that any people is more attached to one plot of land, one city, than the Jewish people are to Jerusalem and to Zion and to Judea and Samaria. And, it's this weird thing where like people's like, well, it's a bunch of Europeans. I'm like, okay, yeah, there were Jews in Europe who emigrated to Israel. But if you go to Israel, over 50% of Israeli Jews are not European. They're from Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia and Iran and Egypt and Turkey. And if you go to Egypt, you're like, wow, there's a lot of brown people here because that's the nature of Egypt or nature of Israel. Ethiopian Jews. I mean, it's a kaleidoscope. And I think a lot of the left-wing anti-Israel, not that there aren't valid points to be had for sure, but a lot of it is based on this like super progressive, woke, anti-colonial, anti-establishment, and because Israel is kind of winning right now, and they're they're seen as cozy with the United States. It's this like weird, like you're on my team, so you must be against this team, and it's like okay, like I'll give you a perfect example. The idea of queers for Palestine is just the perfect example. Queers for Palestine. Listen, I have a lot of Palestinian friends. A lot of my Palestinian friends can't come on this channel because they're scared for their lives. I'm not kidding. Friends who like, I would love to talk, but my family lives there or whatever. So it's not anti-Palestinian to point out the fact that in some of these places like Gaza, if you were openly gay, it would not go well with you. And yet the largest, pride parade in the Middle East is in Tel Aviv. And so it's just this like weird, like, what's the word? Association. Well, it's like, okay, well, if you're against this group, I'm against this group. And so Israel has been labeled this thing, which is just fundamentally not accurate. And so I could go on for a long time about the reality of the situation. But I think, again, it stems back from a demonic idea. The left, their view of Israel, to me, is a demonic thing. Like you can't separate, in my opinion, the obsession with Israel when literally next door in Syria, maybe, estimates of 1 million people have died since the beginning of the Arab Spring. And it's like, okay, no one cares about that at all. Or in Sudan, or in Yemen, no one cares. But like, there's this saying, it's true, actually, no Jews, no news. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people fall for it.
Yeah. Look, I think so much of this is important to talk about, even though it can be hard to hear, right? When you're learning that there are issues even within your own perspective, whether it comes to conservatism or progressivism. I think this is a topic that is certainly critical, especially as Christians, that we talk about and that we get right. Listen, everybody, stick with us. We're going to fit in a quick break. We'll be right back with more Faith versus Culture. Welcome back to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News channel. I'm joined by Raj Nair. Yeah, Raj, you're new to the Faith versus Culture audience here. You are a host at CBN News, and you cover predominantly things related to Israel. So talk a little bit about your passion for Israel. You said in the previous segment you've been to the state of Israel dozens of times, and this is something that you have spent a great deal of time studying. So just give us a little bit of your background and interest in this subject.
Yeah, I've always done broadcast, but I started in like sports. Like I was an Ohio State football beat reporter, a USC football beat reporter. I worked in Hollywood. I've hosted a kids show for the Blaze. Like I've done a bunch of random stuff. But long story short, in 2011, I was part of this event called Restoring Courage. If you're watching, you know what that is, with Glenn Beck back in 2011, and it rocked my world. I was in Israel for like I think a month and a half. And I got to go to all the gnarly places, and it just connected all the dots. And then I think the gateway to really falling in love with what God's up to is falling in love with all 66 books of the Bible, right? So one of the things that breaks my heart in the Middle East, you'll see a lot of things where it's just the New Testament. Like we're a New Testament church, and it's just the New Testament. I'm like, I don't know why, but that sets off alarm bells in my mind where it's like, yeah, I get that, but like, what did Jesus? We're trying to be like Jesus, right? What did he preach from? Well, when he was tempted by the devil, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and then he was preaching Isaiah. It's like, guys, like to me, when you fall in love with the Old Testament, because I don't think God's changed. I think it's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I think if we want to love Yeshua, we should love what he loved, and he loved the scriptures. And so when I started really unpacking, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Deuteronomy, the Psalms, it's like this thing was just exploding in my face. And I've always loved apologetics, being able to give a defense for the faith that you profess scientifically, archaeologically. But my favorite apologetic maybe not my experience with Yeshua is number one, but right after that, it's just seeing these promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, seeing the promises that God made to Israel, these ridiculous, absurd, totally impossible, never could happen promises. And yet I can board a plane and in 14 hours from California be in the fruition of said promise. And you're just like, he did it. Why are we not freaking out about this? Like, he did the most ridiculous, impossible thing in the history of the world. Why is no one freaking out about this? There is a miracle, a certification, a trophy on your Google Maps, on your Atlas, and it's called Israel. And that certification says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob keeps his promises against all odds, against all probabilities. When every single civilization in the history of the world, almost, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Assyrians, the Nazis, have tried to eradicate them, yet all of those civilizations are pages in a history book, and yet the Jewish people are back in the same land, worshiping the same God, in the same city, on the same hill, speaking the same language, using the same currency. It's just like, it shows shouts of a faithful God that it gets me fired up, as you can tell.
Yeah, no, I think that's awesome. And I think it's proof positive of God's providence, of his ability and willingness and desire, his heart to make promises and then to keep his promises. And I think we've seen that come to fruition with Israel. And look, we're almost a year and a half removed from the October 7th attack. Is one of the deadliest attacks ever against the people of Israel, against Jewish people. And you've talked to so many thought leaders on this subject. You've talked to people in Israel, people who are influencing Israeli policy, even Iranians who are former Muslims, and their perspective on all of this. So what are the people of Israel saying? How are they feeling? Like I said, almost a year and a half removed from that attack. Are they encouraged? Are they still feeling confident about their place in the world?
I think a lot of Israelis, to a lot of people's surprise, there's a large section of Israelis that are very left-leaning, very progressive, you want to call it that, very similar mindset to a lot of atheistic worldviews, a lot of left, kind of anti, what you would call occupation, blah, blah, blah. I think October 7th, how do I say this, sobered a lot of people up where it's like, wow, like maybe maybe rhetoric, maybe being nice, maybe trying really hard to build bridges, maybe that isn't what the other side wants. And that's been a really hard pill to swallow. Like the things that Hamas did were barbaric. They were medieval. They were Aztec people on top of temples, carving up human beings. It was to say demonic would be an understatement. And what Hamas is all about, it says it in their opening charter of the opening line of their opening charter. I mean, it says it right there. Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it. That's what it says. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of innocent Palestinians that get caught in the crossfire, but I think there is a sadness where it's like, wow, this is darker than we could have possibly imagined. And so, but when you say like, what do Israelis think? That's like saying, what do Americans think? Very, very varied opinions.
Yeah, for sure. I know that it's impossibly complex, just like it's impossibly complex our politics here at home in the United States. So I 100% get that, but I want to ask you too, and this is kind of a big question, but it's just a hot topic going on in Israel right now. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, there's been a lot of infighting politically, and perhaps some of it is just because of the fact that there are so many progressives there in the state of Israel, but he's pushing to remove his intel chief. I know that has caused a lot of frustration, not just in Israel, but around the globe. So give us a little bit of a summary, if you can, of the infighting that's going on there right now.
Well, I think people talk about Israel being this like democracy in the Middle East. It's like some of my Israeli friends are like, maybe we democracy too much, because they had like 4 or 5 elections in like 4 or 5 years. I mean, they're just always voting and making new coalitions, and people that are like pretty conservative, not liking Netanyahu because Netanyahu's against the courts, but the courts, are a check against that. It's just politics as usual. Like in the United States, when Trump and Doge, it's kind of similar to that, where people are mad about U.S. aid and letting go of this person in the cabinet. It has a very similar vibe, and I think what it's just a little bit unusual is that in the Middle East for a lot of past decades, it's been these dictators or like fundamentalist groups like HTS that's now in charge of Syria, and so it's kind of this like kind of jarring thing when there's like this democratic infighting. But like I said, I think this kind of goes back to the point of just how varied, how it is not a problem to criticize Israel. You want to meet people that criticize Israel, talk to Israelis. A lot of people don't like Netanyahu. A lot of people love him. A lot of people aren't thrilled what he did with the judicial stuff. A lot of people aren't happy about this Shin Bet firing. It's just it's very, very similar to what I think a lot of people feel about Trump, where it's like he does all these things. And so I don't think it's basically, does the elected government, the Netanyahu government, have more authority to kind of do what they want versus unelected bureaucrats? But it's way more complicated than that. But I think that's the easiest way to understand it in American terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is politics is messy, right? And as Christians, we know we're all sinners and all of us fall way short. So it's always going to be a mess dealing with any kind of situation that involves people, which is all of the situations. So everybody stick with us. We're going to fit in a quick break. We'll be right back with more Faith versus Culture. Welcome back to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News channel. I'm joined by Raj Nair. Raj, as we're kind of wrapping up the conversation, I want to ask you just kind of a 30,000-foot question. Why, as Christians, do we need to be concerned about the state of Israel, and how can we be prayerful for our politicians as they are leading our country when it comes to addressing the state of Israel? Wow,
that 2 minutes. Okay. I think we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the Jewish people, and I think that we would be mistaken to not see what God is up to in the state of Israel. But I'd also say, from a very logistical standpoint, look what else is happening in the Middle East. HTS, the leader of Syria, is basically former Al Qaeda and former ISIS. Iran, The Ayatollahs are crazy apocalyptic people. Yemen, the Houthis. I mean, you go down the list. It is not. I mean, Erdogan, the leader of Turkey. A lot of people would say he's kind of like doing like this like slow burn caliphate thing. Iraq, the militia group. I mean, it is not a friendly place. And Israel, for all of its faults, does have Western democratic values. It is the only country in the Middle East where Christians are absolutely protected. Women have equal rights. The there's Druze people. That's a long story for another time. But I think we have beyond mutual values, but we have a mutual worldview. The Judeo-Christian principle is alive and well in Israel. But I would say, I think the most pro-Israel thing you can do is to read the Old Testament and just get excited about what God's doing. Now, all the complications, October 7th, the judicial thing, and Shin Bet, and the wars, and Hezbollah, all that, we can talk about that. And I have been for well over a decade. But I think we need to start with, what if God is, for lack of better words, flexing on the global stage? And if he is, that's why the whole world hates it, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think there are so many complexities here that are very difficult for us to parse. They're difficult for me to parse, at least. And I'm grateful that we have a sovereign God who we can just, like you said, read scripture and surrender these things then to the Lord and trust that he has a sovereign plan, purpose, and will for all people, including, of course, the people of Israel. So, Raj, thank you so much for being here with us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, buddy.
All right, everybody, stick with us. We'll be right back to wrap up Faith versus Culture. That is all the time we have for this week's episode of Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News channel. Thank you so much for joining us for that conversation about the state of Israel. It's all important stuff. If you want more news from a Christian perspective, including news about Israel, go to cbnnews.com. Never miss any stories. And also check out our Quick Start podcast. It goes out every weekday morning where we break down the news from a Christian perspective. Thank you so much for being here, and God bless you.